6 years. That's how long it takes for a man to walk back into a room and destroy everything you rebuilt with your bare hands. She was pouring coffee when the bell above the door rang. She didn't look up. She never looked up anymore. Looking up meant hoping, and hope was something Elena Marlowe had buried a long time ago, somewhere between the second eviction notice and the night she delivered twins alone in a hospital where no one knew her name. But the air changed. She felt it before she saw him. That particular pressure, the kind that precedes a storm or a verdict. When she finally turned around, the coffee pot nearly slipped from her hand. Roman Veyer stood in the doorway of her rain-soaked diner, and from the back room came the sound of 2 5-year-olds arguing over a crayon. If this story grips you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had been coming down since noon. It was the kind of coastal rain that didn't announce itself dramatically. No thunder, no lightning show. Just a gray, steady curtain that soaked through everything slowly, patiently, the way certain kinds of grief worked. The kind that didn't announce itself as grief at all. The kind that just became the weather of your life. Elena Marlowe had lived under that particular weather for 6 years. She'd stopped naming it somewhere around year 2, when Miles was cutting his first teeth and Mara had developed a scream that could strip paint, and Elena was working the breakfast shift at a diner 40 miles north of the last place anyone who knew the name Veyer would think to look. She'd stopped calling it heartbreak. She'd stopped calling it anything. She'd just gotten up every morning, put on the faded blue apron, tied her hair back, and made coffee for strangers. It was a small diner, 8 tables, a long counter with 6 stools, a kitchen that smelled permanently of griddle grease and old wood, and it sat at the edge of a coastal town called Dre's Hollow, where the population dropped by 1/3 every winter, and the locals were the kind of people who asked no questions and expected the same courtesy returned. Elena had chosen it for exactly that reason. She wasn't hiding. That was what she told herself. She was just living quietly. The distinction mattered, even if only to her. It was a Thursday afternoon in November when the bell above the door rang at 4:17 p.m. Elena knew the time because she'd been watching the clock, willing the last 43 minutes of her shift to pass. Her feet hurt. Miles had been running a low fever since Tuesday, and she'd slept maybe 4 hours. And the morning rush had gone long because Dee, the other waitress, had called in sick again. Elena had been on her feet for 9 hours, and she still had the closing side work, wiping down the counter, refilling the sugar caddies, prepping the next morning's coffee station. And then she had to pick up the twins from Mrs. Paulson next door and get Miles his medicine and somehow produce dinner out of whatever was left in the refrigerator, which she was fairly certain meant eggs and toast. She didn't look up when the bell rang. She was refilling the napkin dispensers at the far end of the counter, her back to the door, her mind already in the parking lot, already on the drive home, already in the kitchen measuring out children's fever reducer into the small plastic cup. "I'll be right with you," she said. "Sit anywhere." There was no response. She finished with the napkin dispenser, picked up the coffee pot. It was the old glass kind, the weight of it familiar in her hand, a certain comfort in its solidity. She turned around. Roman Veyer was standing just inside the doorway. He was soaked. His dark coat was dark with rain, his black hair pushed back from his face, water still dripping from the line of his jaw. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe that was just what 6 years of accumulating everything, empire, reputation, silence, did to a man. He looked like he'd walked out of the specific nightmare she'd spent 6 years making herself stop having. His gray eyes found her immediately. That was the thing about Roman Veyer. His eyes had always found her immediately. From across rooms, across years, apparently across the 600 miles she'd put between them. Those gray eyes, cold and precise as river ice in January, locked onto her face with the kind of focus that had nothing to do with searching and everything to do with having already arrived. He didn't move. Elena didn't move. The coffee pot was in her hand. The weight of it. The heat of it through the glass. She became suddenly, acutely aware of the apron she was wearing, faded blue cotton, the pocket fraying, a small bleach stain near the hem, and then she hated herself for being aware of it, for caring, even for 1 second, what she looked like standing in this diner, in this apron, in this rain-gray town she'd made her life in. She looked fine. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had survived. From the back of the diner, From behind the swinging kitchen door that she'd wedged open with the doorstop so she could hear them came the sound of Miles and Mara fighting over something, their voices overlapping, Miles's lower and more aggrieved, Mara's sharper and utterly uncompromising. Roman's eyes moved, just slightly, just a fraction of a degree, toward the sound, and then back to Elena. His face did something complicated and controlled and then went very, very still. Elena's grip tightened on the coffee pot. He took one step forward, stopped, like he was making a decision about the distance between them, about whether he had the right to reduce it. Elena. Her name in his mouth. The specific way he said it. 3 syllables. The middle one carried longer than it needed to be. An old habit of his she'd spent 2 years trying to unhear and then stopped trying because unhearing things turned out to be impossible. You just learn to live with the frequency. "We're about to close," she said. His jaw moved. "It's 4 in the afternoon. I close early on Thursdays." It was not Thursday. It was Thursday, actually, but she didn't close early. She never closed early. She needed every shift, every dollar, every 20-cent tip from the fisherman who came in at 6 a.m., smelling of salt and brine, and ordered the $2 coffee and left a quarter on the counter. She needed all of it. She had always needed all of it. But her mouth had said it before her brain had produced anything more useful. Roman looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the coffee pot in her hand. He looked at the apron. He looked at the counter, the tired diner, the water-streaked windows, the rain-blurred view of the coastal road outside. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that wasn't quite an expression. "Black coffee," he said. "Please." The please landed strangely. Roman Vare did not, historically, say please. He stated things. He decided things. He moved through rooms like weather systems, like inevitability, and the people around him adjusted their trajectories accordingly. She had adjusted her trajectory accordingly for 2 years, and it had cost her everything. She could refuse. She could tell him to leave. She could... And this option presented itself to her with a certain bright, reckless clarity. Throw the coffee pot at his head. Instead, she turned around, poured the coffee, and set it on the counter. He sat down on one of the stools, 3 feet away from her. The proximity was... it was a lot. She could smell rain on him, and beneath that the same thing she'd always been able to smell on him. Something specific to his skin that she did not have a name for and refused to excavate a name for right now, in this moment, in the middle of her actual life. He wrapped both hands around the mug, didn't drink, looked at her. "You cut your hair," he said. It was possibly the most insane thing he could have said. She had, in fact, cut her hair. 6 years ago, she'd worn it long, dark, past her shoulders, and now it was shorter, practical, the kind of cut you got because you didn't have time or money or energy to deal with long hair. But that he had noticed. That was what he said. "What are you doing here, Roman?" Not a question. The inflection was flat, a statement of exhaustion rather than inquiry. He turned the mug slightly in his hands, a small, controlled gesture. "I was in the area." "You don't do in the area. You do targeted, deliberate, and precisely coordinated." Something shifted in his face. It might have been, on someone else, the beginning of a smile. "You remember me." "I remember everything," she said. "That's the problem." The kitchen door swung open and Miles came out. He was 5 years old and small for his age, with her dark hair and her stubbornness written all over the set of his mouth. But his eyes were Roman's. That specific gray, clear as shallow water over stone, precise and still, and seeing too much. He was wearing a dinosaur shirt with a mustard stain on it and holding a red crayon, and behind him came Mara, who had the same eyes and a rounder face, her dark hair and 2 uneven pigtails that Elena had put in that morning before the school run and before the fever check and before the 9-hour shift. "Mom," Miles said, "Mara took the red, and I had it first, and she..." He stopped. He'd registered the stranger at the counter. Miles was cautious around strangers, always had been. A habit of alertness he'd been born with, or maybe a habit of alertness he'd absorbed from his mother's particular way of moving through the world. Mara had no such caution. She walked straight up to the counter and climbed onto a stool 2 down from Roman and put both elbows on the counter and looked at him directly. "Hi," she said. Roman looked at her. It was not a normal look. It was the kind of look that did something to the air in the room. Elena had watched Roman Vare conduct boardroom negotiations. watched him reduce grown men to silence with nothing more than a sustained gaze. She had never seen him look like this, like he was looking at something that had rearranged in a single second every prior understanding of the world. "Hi," he said. His voice was different, quieter. Something had been taken out of it. Mara studied him with the frank, unblinking assessment of someone who had not yet learned to be polite about staring. "You're wet," she observed. "It's raining. You should have an umbrella." She said it with complete authority. Then she looked at Elena. "Mom, can we have hot chocolate?" "In a minute, baby." Elena came around the counter. She positioned herself between the twins and Roman, not obviously, not dramatically. She just moved her body into the space between them. A quiet, practiced repositioning that she hoped looked casual and suspected did not. "Go back to the kitchen. I'll bring it in." "But, Mara." She said it with the specific frequency that meant non-negotiable, and Mara, who had an excellent internal sensor for that frequency, slid off the stool. Miles had not moved from the doorway. He was still watching Roman with that careful stillness, and Roman was looking at Miles now, and his jaw had tightened, and the knuckles of his hands around the coffee mug had gone slightly pale. "Miles," Elena said. "Steady, steady. Go with your sister." Miles looked at her, then back at Roman, then at her again. "Okay, he said, and disappeared through the kitchen door. Mara followed. The door swung shut behind them. The diner was quiet except for the rain on the windows and the distant sound of the twins resuming their crayon negotiation in the kitchen. Elena turned back to the counter. She picked up a cloth and began wiping down the section near Roman in long, methodical strokes. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. She was extremely proud of that. "They're 5, Roman said. "Yes." "Their eyes." Roman. "Elena." He set down the coffee mug. Not roughly, with control, the way he did everything, with that terrible, precise control. "Are they mine?" The cloth stopped moving. She'd known this question was coming. She'd known it from the moment she'd turned around and seen him standing in the doorway. She'd known that this was the question this moment had been building toward since before it happened, since before he walked into her diner, since before he drove to this coastal town, since whatever chain of events had led him here had first been set in motion. She'd known it, and she had still not prepared for the way it felt to hear it, the way those 4 words cut sideways through 6 years of silence. She looked at him. His face was very still. The stillness of a man holding himself to an extreme standard of control because the alternative was something he had decided not to do. "You don't get to ask that anymore," she said. It landed the way she'd intended it to. She watched it land. She watched something move through him. Not nothing, definitely. Not nothing. His chest expanded on a breath he didn't release. His jaw went tighter, that muscle in his cheek. "Elena." "We're closed," she said. "Please go." He didn't move. She moved instead, walked to the door, turned the sign from open to closed, and stood beside it with her hand on the frame, waiting. Roman looked at the closed sign, looked at her, looked very briefly toward the kitchen door. Then he stood up. Took his wallet out, left a folded bill on the counter that she did not look at closely enough to identify the denomination. He walked to the door, stopped less than 2 feet from her. This close she could see the lines of his face in detail. He was 34 now, and time had written itself into him with more weight than years alone should produce. Lines around his eyes that hadn't been there, something harder and more careful about the set of his mouth. He'd always been handsome in that cold architectural way, the kind of handsome that was more about structure than warmth. And he still was, and she hated that she still thought so. "I'll be in town," he said. "There's a motel on Route 9 that takes cash. Checkout is at 11. "Elena." She opened the door. The rain came in, cold and salt-smelling. "Good night, Roman." He stepped out into it. She closed the door behind him. She turned the deadbolt. Then she stood with her back against the door and her eyes on the ceiling, and she breathed slowly, in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way she'd taught herself to breathe after Miles and Mara were born, and the panic attacks came back for 6 months, and she had no one, to sit with her through them. In, out. The crayon argument in the kitchen had progressed to what sounded like minor structural damage. Elena pushed off the door. put the coffee pot back on the burner, picked up the bill Roman had left on the counter, $100, for 1 cup of black coffee. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went to make her children hot chocolate. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the narrow room in the small house she rented from old Callum Brace for $600 a month. A house that had original windows and a radiator that banged and a kitchen that faced the sea. And she stared at the ceiling and listened to Miles breathe in the next room. His fever had come down. She'd checked it twice. 99.1, which wasn't nothing but wasn't scary, and he'd eaten half a piece of toast and kept it down. And Mara had curled against his side and told him a long, elaborate story about a horse that could do math. And Elena had stood in the doorway watching them and thought, this is what I protected. This is what I chose. This was worth everything I paid. She believed that. She had always believed that. But lying in the dark at 2 a.m. with Roman Vare somewhere in this town, she could feel it. The specific electromagnetic disturbance of his presence, some radar in her body that she'd never successfully shut down, believing it required more effort than it usually did. She thought about the way he'd looked at Mara. She thought about the way he'd looked at Miles. She thought about the question he'd asked and the way his voice had sounded asking it, stripped of the usual command, stripped of the precision and the authority, just a man in a rain-soaked coat asking a question that had no good answer. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and felt her own heartbeat, steady, stubborn. You survived him once, she told herself. You can survive this. It wasn't entirely convincing, but it was what she had. The next morning, she drove the twins to school and drove back and parked behind the diner and sat in her car for 3 minutes before going in. The cliffside mansion to the north of town, the Ashford property, it had been empty for years, the Ashford family having died out and left it to decay through a series of contested wills and legal limbo, had a light on in the upper story. It hadn't had a light on yesterday. Elena got out of her car. She went inside and put on her apron and started the coffee and didn't look out the north-facing window for the rest of the morning. She was largely successful. Garrett Finch came in at 8 a.m., the way he did every morning, big coat and fisherman's hands and a face that had been weathered by the coast into something permanent and immovable. He ordered the breakfast special and black coffee, and he read the same paper he'd been getting delivered for 20 years, even though most of the news in it was from 48 hours ago. Heard the Ashford place sold, he said, without looking up from the paper. Elena refilled his coffee. When? Yesterday. Cash sale, apparently. He turned a page. Whoever it was paid over asking. People do that. Not for that place. That place needs $50,000 in work minimum, and it's not worth the view. He looked up. Some out-of-town type, young, expensive coat. Elena said nothing. Garrett Finch looked at her for a moment with his pale, weathered eyes. Somebody's trouble, he said. It wasn't a question. Nobody's trouble, Elena said. Just someone who likes the view. He returned to his paper. Elena went to the kitchen and stood over the griddle and told herself that Roman buying the Ashford mansion didn't mean anything. People bought property. People made investments. Roman Vare had spent 6 years building an empire out of precisely the kind of transactions that were never fully explained and never fully questioned. And buying a decaying cliffside house in a small coastal town was probably just one more such transaction. He wasn't staying. He was making a point. He would make the point and she would not react to it, and eventually he would leave. But he didn't leave. By Friday she'd seen his car twice. A black vehicle, expensive and understated, the kind designed to look less expensive than it was, parked at the edge of the harbor road, not outside the diner, not anywhere that could be called surveillance, just there, in the places where people parked when they were looking at the sea. He didn't come back into the diner. That was almost worse, because the thing about Roman Vare was that he was patient. She'd always known he was patient. It was one of the things that had terrified and attracted her in equal measure. That absolute willingness to wait while the landscape shifted in his favor. He had built an empire by being the person in the room who was most willing to let time do what force couldn't. He was waiting. The question was, for what? She was wiping down the tables after the lunch rush when her phone buzzed. The number wasn't in her contacts. She almost didn't answer. But the area code was from a city she'd left behind, and her stomach made a small, cold decision before her brain was fully involved. Hello? Elena. A woman's voice, smooth, measured, carrying the particular quality of someone who had rehearsed every inflection. It's been a long time. Elena set down the cloth. She walked to the back of the diner, through the kitchen, out the back door into the small gravel lot where the dumpsters were, and stood in the gray cold with her hand tight around the phone. Celeste. A pause that was not surprise. Celeste Veyer didn't do surprise. She did pauses calibrated to create it in others. You know why I'm calling. I have a working theory. Roman is there. Not a question. Apparently, Elena. The smoothness of her voice shifted slightly, a crack in the veneer, something underneath it that might have been fear if Elena hadn't known better than to read Celeste Veyer charitably. You can't let him find out. You understand what that does, not just to me, to you. Don't say their names. A beat. Don't, Elena said again, and her voice was quiet and entirely serious. Say their names to me. I'm trying to protect you. You have never tried to protect me, not once in my life, not in the single moment when it mattered. The cold was getting into her through the back of her coat, but she barely felt it. You staged a scene so I would disappear. I disappeared. You got what you wanted. I didn't want... Celeste. She said it the way you'd say, stop. I don't care what you wanted. I don't care what you want now. If you call this number again, I'll tell him everything. She hung up. She stood in the gravel lot for a moment, looking at the back of her small, real, acquired, inch-by-inch life. Her hands were not steady. That evening, after she picked up the twins and made dinner and did bath time and read half of a chapter book about a lighthouse keeper Tamara, Miles had fallen asleep before page 4, his fever finally gone, his small body slack and certain in its sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking and looked at the wall. 6 years ago, in Roman's house, she had walked into a room and seen what she thought she saw. She had been so certain. Celeste had known her well enough to know what certainty looked like on Elena and what it would make her do. Run. Go silent. Disappear. Because Elena Marlowe's one great weakness, the crack in the architecture of her, was that when she believed something completely, when the evidence was right in front of her and her gut confirmed it, she didn't fight. She folded. She got very quiet and very cold, and she removed herself from the equation. She had removed herself from the equation. She had been 23 and 8 weeks pregnant, and she had removed herself from the equation and driven north and north and north until she couldn't think about Roman Veyer's face anymore. And then she'd had his children in a hospital in a town where nobody knew her name, and she'd rebuilt herself from the ground up out of coffee and double shifts and the particular ferocity that comes from being responsible for 2 people who have no one else. She had been certain. But there was a but, buried somewhere in that night's memory. She'd always known there was a but. She'd always known there was something she'd resolved not to examine, some detail her mind had gone around rather than through, because going through it meant questioning the certainty, and questioning the certainty meant... She got up from the table, put the tea in the sink, checked the locks, went to bed. Saturday morning, Roman was in the diner at 7. He sat at the counter. He ordered black coffee. He didn't speak to her beyond the order. She poured his coffee and served her other customers and did not look at him more than necessary. At 7:40, Miles and Mara came out of the back room. She brought them with her on Saturday mornings, before school ran on weekdays, and set them up with coloring books and the small portable tablet she'd bought secondhand for exactly this purpose. Miles saw Roman and stopped. Roman saw Miles and did not stop. He was already still, already containing whatever was happening in his chest under that rigid, expensive quiet. Miles walked to the counter, climbed up on a stool. Not next to Roman, 2 down, the same cautious distance he'd maintained the first time, like he was measuring something. He opened his coloring book. He colored for several minutes. Roman did not look at him directly, but Elena could see from the line of Roman's shoulders that every molecule of his attention was occupied by the small boy 2 stools away. "What's your name?" Miles said, without looking up from the page. Roman was quiet for a moment. "Roman." Miles considered this. That's a weird name. Miles is a weird name, Roman said. No, it's not. Miles looked up. Those gray eyes meeting gray eyes, the family resemblance so precise, it was almost cruel. My mom named me after a musician. Miles Davis. Miles looked surprised in the unguarded way children were surprised, openly, with their whole face. You know him? He's the reason I started listening to jazz. Miles processed this. Do you live here? I'm staying for a while. At the motel? Elena, who was pouring coffee at the far end of the counter, felt her shoulders tighten. At the house on the cliff, Roman said. Miles's face did something complicated and thoughtful. The scary one? It's not that scary. Robbie Finch says it's haunted. Robbie Finch is misinformed. Miles almost smiled, caught himself. He was his mother's son. He didn't give things away. My mom says there's no such thing as haunted houses. She says it's just buildings that used to have people in them. Roman went very still. She says empty is sad, not scary, Miles continued. She says everything's less scary if you figure out the true thing about it. Roman looked at the counter for a moment, at his coffee, at some middle distance. Your mom, he said carefully, sounds very smart. She is, Miles said simply. She's the smartest person I know. Elena put the coffee pot down before she dropped it. Doug. After the breakfast rush, after Roman had paid and left, another $100 bill, she was going to have to address the $100 bills. She caught Dee watching her from the kitchen doorway with an expression that was too perceptive for a Tuesday morning. The guy on the corner stool, Dee said. Customer, Elena said. He tipped you $100 for a $3 coffee. He's a bad tipper in the conventional sense. Elena. She looked up. Dee was 42. Originally from a different kind of coast, a person who had relocated herself for reasons she had never specified, and Elena had never asked, because Dre's Hollow ran on that compact. She had the steady, unflinching gaze of someone who had been through her own significant weather. He looks at you like something happened, Dee said. Something happened. And the boy? Elena went back to refilling the sugar caddy. Clear the foretop, please. The McCready couple will be in at 10. Dee was quiet for a moment. I'm just saying, she said. He looks at the boy the way people look at things they recognize. Dee. I'm clearing the foretop, Dee said, and went to do it. Yeah. She'd been 19 when she first met Roman Vare. This was the version of the story she did not tell. Not to Dee, not to Mrs. Paulson next door, not to anyone in Dre's Hollow who had absorbed her into their quiet without asking for an origin. She did not tell it because it required explaining who she'd been then, naive and ambitious in the specific way of people who grew up without money and had taught themselves to perform confidence as protective coloration. She'd been working for a legal firm that did contract work for one of Roman's holding companies. Not for Roman directly. 2 firms removed. She was a second-year paralegal, and she'd attended a meeting that he had also attended, and at the end of it, he'd asked her name. That was the whole catastrophe in miniature. He'd asked her name, and she'd told him, and then he'd remembered it. She had not been the kind of woman Roman Vare was supposed to want. She'd known that immediately. His world was full of women who were polished and strategic and dressed like weapons, and Elena was someone who bought her suits from a consignment shop and had a scar on her chin from a bicycle accident at 9 and couldn't play the social games his circle required because she'd never been taught the rules. She was honest in ways that were inconvenient. She said things directly. She didn't manage him. She thought that was why he'd wanted her. She'd loved him for 2 years with the specific terror of someone who knows they're out of their depth and keeps swimming anyway. She'd loved him knowing it would cost her. She just had no idea the price would be this particular. And then she'd walked into a room, and she'd seen what she saw. And Celeste had been standing right there, watching her face, making sure she saw. Sunday morning, he didn't come in. She found herself checking the door throughout the shift and hated herself for it. At noon, when the diner was half empty and the rain had cleared into a pale, watery winter sun, she looked up from the register and saw him out on the harbor road. He was crouched down. Mara was standing in front of him. She had somehow gotten outside without Elena noticing, that was happening more now that she was 5 and had opinions about doors and autonomy, and she was talking, and Roman was listening with his full attention in the way that cost most adults considerable effort, but which he appeared to perform naturally. His elbows were on his knees, bringing himself down to her height, not commanding, not performing, just there. Mara pointed at something down the dock. Roman looked. Elena's chest did something she didn't permit, and she walked to the back door and opened it and said calmly, "Mara?" Mara looked over. "Mom, there's a seal." "I see him. Come in, please." "He's right there." Mara. The frequency again. Mara came, but reluctantly, throwing one last look over her shoulder at the harbor. Roman straightened up. He looked at Elena across the distance of the coastal road. She looked back at him. "She walked out on her own," he said. "I wasn't—" "I know," Elena said. "Come inside, it's cold." It was said before she thought about it. The sentence just came out, in the practical tone she used for the twins, for Dee, for Garrett Finch, who never wore enough layers. Come inside, it's cold. A basic reflexive human kindness toward someone standing in the November air. She turned around and went back inside. After a moment, she heard the door open behind her. He sat at the counter. She poured the coffee she didn't ask him if he wanted. Mara had gone back to the kitchen, satisfied about the seal, already orbiting to the next thing. Miles was in the kitchen too. She could hear him, the familiar low murmur of his self-narrated play. "Why did you come here?" she said. Not the same question as before. This one was genuine. Roman held the mug in both hands. "I was looking for you." "For 6 years?" "Not for 6 years." Something moved across his face. "I stopped looking, then I started again." She waited. "There were inconsistencies," he said, "in what I was told about why you left. I started looking at them." He paused. "I found where you were 14 months ago. It took me until now to come." 14 months. He'd known for 14 months and waited. "Why?" she said. "Because I needed to understand what happened before I showed up." His jaw tightened. "I didn't want to walk in here and—" He stopped, started again. "I needed to know if I had a right to." The diner was quiet around them, the sound of the sea outside, the sounds of her children in the kitchen. "And?" she said. "Do you?" He looked at her. "I don't know," he said. That's the honest answer. I don't know. She appreciated the honesty. She didn't tell him she appreciated it. She picked up the cloth and started wiping the counter again. "Celeste called me," she said. His expression shifted, became colder. "She told me not to tell you anything." Elena kept her voice level. She seemed frightened. "She should be," Roman said quietly. "She said she was trying to protect me." Roman set down the coffee mug with a care that was very close to violence. What she was trying to protect, he said, was herself. Elena looked at him. Something was shifting in the room, in the air between them, some tectonic adjustment of what was known versus what was admitted. "Roman." She set down the cloth. "What do you know?" He was quiet for a moment, a long moment. "I know she staged something," he said. "I know you saw it. I know it was designed to make you believe." He stopped. His voice was controlled, every word placed precisely, the way you place things when you were afraid of what happened if they fell. "I know that whatever you saw that night wasn't what it was made to look like." Elena's hands went flat on the counter, on the sofa. "I pushed her away," he said. "Celeste. I pushed her away and told her to get out, and she—" He exhaled through his nose. "I don't know what happened after that. I don't know what you walked into, but I know what I did and what I didn't do. And I know that you ran because of something, and I know that Celeste has been very careful for 6 years to seem sad about your disappearance." Elena was very still. Somewhere in the locked room of that night's memory, the one she'd been going around for 6 years, a door she had not known was still closed, was quietly opening. "I need you to leave," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "I need you to leave right now." Roman looked at her. "Please," she said. He stood. He left the bill on the counter. He walked to the door and he stopped there, his hand on the frame, his back to her. "They have my eyes," he said, quietly. Not an accusation, just a thing that was true and needed saying. I know you know what that means, Elena. I know you've always known. He walked out. Elena stood at the counter. The locked door in her memory swung open, and behind it was 6 years of carrying something she had never let herself fully examine. And in the kitchen, her daughter was singing something tuneless to herself, and her son was narrating a story she couldn't quite hear, and the $100 bill was on the counter between her hands. She pressed both palms flat against the cold formica, breathed. Outside, she heard his car start, heard it drive north toward the cliff, toward the empty house he'd bought because he intended to stay. The door in her memory was open now. And what was behind it, what she had spent 6 years refusing to look at directly, was not what she'd believed. That night, Roman had pushed Celeste away. She had not seen the beginning of the scene. She had only seen the end. She had built 6 years of her life on a single, incomplete image, and Celeste had known she would, had counted on it, had stood right there in the frame and made sure the angle was wrong. Elena picked up the $100 bill. Her hands were shaking now. 6 years, 2 children, a faded apron and a coffee pot, and a small house with original windows, and the sea through them every morning, and all of it, every shift, every eviction notice, every night she'd cried in the parking lot after closing so the twins wouldn't hear. All of it built on a lie that someone had deliberately constructed and placed for her to walk into. In the kitchen, Mara's tuneless song continued. Miles had gone quiet, in the particular way he went quiet, when he was thinking hard about something. Elena Marlowe put the $100 bill in her apron pocket, picked up the cloth, and went back to work. But something had changed, quietly and irrevocably, in the foundation of everything. And Celeste Veyer, who had called from a number Elena didn't recognize, from a city Elena hadn't left, frightened in a way Elena had never heard in her voice before. Celeste, who had spent 6 years maintaining a careful distance from the truth she'd manufactured, was about to discover that the woman she'd built her lie around had spent 6 years becoming someone who did not run anymore. Elena folded the cloth, set it on the counter, looked at the door Roman had just walked through. The twins were in this kitchen, alive and loud and entirely themselves. And Roman Veyer was in the cliff house at the north end of town with his gray eyes and his $100 bills and the information he'd spent 14 months collecting. And Celeste was somewhere frightened and maneuvering, and all of the pieces of a thing Elena had refused to look at for 6 years were lying out in front of her now, arranged by the afternoon light into something that looked unmistakably like the beginning of a reckoning. She was not going to run this time. She was going to find out exactly what happened that night, and then she was going to decide, not react, not flee, not fold, decide what happened next. The decision settled in her chest like ballast. She breathed around it. Then the kitchen door swung open and Miles appeared in the frame, his expression carrying that careful, ancient for 5 gravity of his. "Mom," he said, "that man, Roman." Elena looked at him. "He has my eyes," Miles said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation. It was just a child who had been watching and thinking, applying the particular intelligence he'd been born with to the evidence in front of him, arriving at a conclusion with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned early that the world made more sense if you paid attention to it. Elena held her son's gaze. "Come here," she said. He came. She crouched down in front of him, the way Roman had crouched down in front of Mara outside, and she took his face in her hands, and she looked at him, really looked, the way you looked at something precious and complicated and entirely yours. "We're going to have a conversation," she said. "You and me. Not today. Soon." Miles's expression was very serious. "Is it bad?" "No," she said. "It's complicated, but it's not bad." He thought about this, nodded once, in that decisive Roman way of his. "Okay," he said. He went back to the kitchen, and outside, at the end of the coastal road, the light was on in the cliff house. The man who had once destroyed her with 4 words was 31 days into earning the right to ask a different kind of question. And Elena Marlowe, who had survived poverty and heartbreak and single motherhood and the specific loneliness of being invisible by choice, was standing at the counter of her diner with ballast in her chest and something bright and terrifying just beginning to open in the back of her mind. Something that felt, against all evidence and all reason, like the beginning of the truth coming home. The light in the cliff house stayed on past midnight. Elena knew because she was awake. She'd been awake since 10, when the twins finally settled and the house went quiet, and she had nothing left to manage except the inside of her own head, which turned out to be a full-time occupation. She sat at the kitchen table with cold tea in the window that faced north, and she could see it from there. Not clearly, just the pale smear of illumination above the tree line, the way you'd see a lighthouse from a distance. Present, steady, not going anywhere. She'd spent 2 hours trying not to think about what Miles had said. He has my eyes. 5 years old, and he'd said it the same way you'd say the sky is blue or the tide comes in. As observable fact, requiring no emotional scaffolding, just the clean acknowledgement of a thing that was true. She'd underestimated him. She was always underestimating him, always calibrating for the age on the birth certificate instead of the mind behind those gray eyes. Roman's eyes. She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose and breathed. The problem, the specific structural problem she'd been avoiding examining, was this. She had left believing Roman had betrayed her. She had built the entire architecture of her departure on that belief. Every choice she'd made in 6 years was downstream of that moment in that room, that image, that certainty. And if the certainty was wrong, if what she'd seen was staged, if the angle was deliberate, if Celeste had stood in that frame and manufactured the evidence because she knew exactly what Elena would do with it, then Elena had not protected her children from their father. She had taken them from him. The distinction was not small. She got up from the table, put her cup in the sink, stood at the window and looked at the light on the cliff. She thought about Roman's voice saying I pushed her away. She thought about the particular quality of his stillness at the counter. Not the stillness of a man managing guilt, but the stillness of a man managing fury. She'd known him long enough to know the difference. Guilt made Roman go quiet in a specific, contained way. Fury made him go still, the way water went still before it froze. Surface calm over enormous pressure. He was furious, not at her, at what had been done. She went to bed at 2 a.m. and stared at the ceiling until the alarm went off at 5:30, and then she got up and made lunches and checked Miles's temperature. Normal, finally, and drove the twins to school in the gray coastal dawn. Monday the diner was slow. Low cloud cover, no tourists, just the regulars. Garrett Finch and his paper. The McCready couple, who ordered the same thing every time without looking at the menu. Young Soph Keller, who worked the harbor master office and came in for coffee and whatever pie was fresh on her lunch break. Roman came in at 9. He sat at the counter. She poured his coffee. She was not going to pretend Saturday hadn't happened. She was not going to pretend Miles hadn't said what he'd said, or that the door in her memory hadn't swung open and refused to close again. She was done with pretending. She'd spent 6 years being very good at pretending, and she was finished. I need to ask you something, she said. He looked up from the coffee. That night. She kept her voice level, kept her hands occupied with the cloth and the counter. I walked in at... She stopped, recalibrated. What time did Celeste leave? His jaw moved. You're remembering. I'm trying to. She looked at him directly. What time? 9:45, maybe 10. He held her gaze. There was nothing evasive in it. I told her to get out. She didn't go quietly. By the time she left, you... He paused. You weren't there anymore. Elena calculated the gap. The drive. The timing of what she'd seen versus what she hadn't. She knew, Elena said, quietly. Not to him. To herself, to the specific cold clarity of it. She knew exactly when to call me. She knew I'd come at 9:30. Before it was over, before you... Yes, Roman said. One word, no elaboration. He'd done his own math months ago and arrived at the same answer. The diner was quiet around them. Garrett Finch turned a page of his paper. The radiator clicked. 6 years, Elena said. I know. My children. She stopped. Her throat closed around the next sentence. She set the cloth down flat on the counter and looked at the surface of it instead of his face. Miles and Mara have never... She stopped again, pressed her hand flat against the counter, pressed down until she could feel the pressure in her wrist. Elena. His voice was different. Something in it she wasn't prepared for. Not soft, Roman didn't do soft, but stripped. the tone of someone who had also been awake until 2 a.m. I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I need you to understand that. She looked up. I'm here because they're mine, he said, and because you matter, and because someone deliberately... He stopped. Something moved through his face, fast and violent, and controlled back down. Someone needs to answer for what was taken. Celeste, yes. Called me again. His eyes went sharp. When? Yesterday morning. Said I had to keep quiet. Said she was protecting me. Elena almost laughed. She sounded scared. She should be. He said it with a flatness that had weight in it. She has been managing my belief that you left voluntarily for 6 years. If that structure collapses, what does that mean for her? It means she loses everything. His voice was measured and entirely without mercy. She's been positioned close to me because I trusted her, because I believed her version of what happened. That trust is what's protected her. Elena looked at him. What are you going to do? Nothing yet. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. I needed to see you first. I needed to know what you remembered. And now? Now I know she staged it. He looked at her directly. The question is whether you'll let me do what comes next. It was not a small question. She understood what comes next meant in the context of Roman Vare's world, what it looked like when he decided someone had committed an unforgivable act against something that belonged to him. She'd seen the edge of it once, years ago, a man who had stolen from his operation and had subsequently vanished so completely from the landscape of his life that even his name stopped being said aloud. I don't want her dead, Elena said. That's not what I was going to do. I need to hear you say that. He held her gaze. I'm not going to kill her. A pause. That would be too easy. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the cloth and resumed wiping the counter because her hands needed something to do. The twins don't know yet, she said. Miles he's put some of it together. He's perceptive, but he doesn't know. She kept her voice matter-of-fact, clinical. If she stayed clinical, she could keep the pressure in her chest from becoming something she couldn't manage in public. I'm not ready for that conversation. I know. You don't get to have it without me. I know that too. She looked at him. You're being very reasonable. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile. Don't get used to it. He came back at 3. The lunch rush was over and Dee had gone home early, and it was just Elena and the quiet afternoon when he walked in and sat at the counter and didn't order anything. She poured him coffee anyway. My investigator found something, he said, about the months after you left. She set the pot down. Celeste told my father you'd taken money from a household account, that you'd gone because you'd gotten what you came for. His jaw was tight. He believed her. He was... A pause. He was not kind in the things he said. Elena stared at him. I didn't believe it, Roman said. I want you to know that. I didn't believe the money story, but I also didn't... He stopped, set both hands flat on the counter. I didn't look hard enough for the first year. I told myself you had your reasons. I was... Another stop. The word he was working toward clearly cost him something. I was hurt, and I told myself it was your choice, and I didn't push. The silence between them had texture. You believed I left, she said. I believed you decided to leave, not that you were manipulated into it. He looked at her. That's different. Is it? Yes. His voice was quiet and precise. Because if I'd known... He stopped, started again. If I had known you were pregnant, Elena, there is nothing on this earth that would have kept me from finding you. You need to understand that. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the lines of his face, at the 6 years written into him, at the specific weight behind those gray eyes that she recognized as grief because she'd been carrying the same weight herself. She looked at the hands flat on the counter, the knuckles, the stillness. She believed him. That was the terrible thing. She looked at him and she believed him, and it didn't fix anything. It made everything simultaneously better and worse, because it meant the last 6 years had been built on a lie she hadn't chosen, and the life she'd built with her bare hands had been constructed in the crater of something that should never have happened. She turned away, went to the kitchen, stood over the sink and looked at her hands under the running water, cold water, the shock of it grounding. Behind her, she heard Dee's voice from the front. Dee had come back for something, keys probably. She was always forgetting things. And then another voice. Not Roman, smooth, measured, the specific quality of a rehearsed performance. Elena turned off the tap. She walked to the kitchen doorway and pushed it open. Celeste Vere was standing in her diner. She was 40 now, 3 years older than Roman, and she wore it like someone who had invested heavily in not wearing it. Immaculate, precise, every surface managed. Dark coat, dark hair, a face that was structurally similar to Roman's but had something in it that Roman's didn't, something that had learned very early how to arrange itself. She saw Elena in the doorway. Roman had gone still on his stool, the particular freeze of someone calculating distance and threat simultaneously. "Elena," Celeste said. The smoothness of her voice was working very hard. "I thought we should talk. In person." "Dee," Elena said, without looking away from Celeste. "You can head out." "Elena, I'm fine. Take the rest of the day." Dee looked at Celeste, looked at Roman, made the kind of rapid assessment that people with functional survival instincts made. "I'll be right outside," she said, and went. The door closed. The three of them in the diner. The rain had started again, a thin coastal hiss against the windows. The radiator clicked. Somewhere down the harbor road, a boat motor turned over. Celeste's eyes moved to Roman. "I didn't know you were here." "Yes, you did," Roman said. A pause. She recovered from it quickly. Elena gave her that. She recovered fast. "Roman, I came to talk to Elena. I didn't come to—" "Why did you come?" Roman's voice was flat and very quiet, the kind of quiet that had pressure behind it. "I came because things are becoming complicated, and I thought if Elena and I could—" "You thought," Roman said, "that if you got here first, you could manage what she tells me." He turned on the stool to face his cousin fully. "You've been managing my information about Elena for 6 years, Celeste. I want to understand exactly how much managing that's involved." Celeste's expression did something complex and quickly smoothed. She looked at Elena. "You told him." "He already knew," Elena said. "He's been investigating for over a year." Something flickered behind Celeste's eyes, fast and then gone. "I did what I did," Celeste said, and her voice had shifted, the smoothness giving way to something raw underneath, something Elena didn't quite trust, because I was trying to protect Roman from a woman who— "Don't," Roman said, "who was never—" "Celeste." The word landed like something physical. She stopped. "You staged a scene so that a woman who was 8 weeks pregnant with my children would run. She ran. She raised my children alone for 6 years in poverty, while you stood next to me at family dinners and told me she'd taken money and left." His voice had not risen. It was exactly the same volume as before. That was what made it terrible. "You told me she chose to leave. You let me believe that. You let me grieve it and move on, and you stood right there." Celeste said nothing. "You let me believe," Roman said, "that I wasn't a father." The rain on the windows. Celeste's hands were clasped in front of her. Her knuckles were pale. "I didn't know she was pregnant." "I don't believe you," Roman said. "Roman!" The timeline, Celeste. His voice was still flat, still controlled, still terrifying in its precision. She was visibly— She would have shown. By the time— He stopped. Something crossed his face that he shut down fast. "By the time Miles and Mara were born, how long had it been?" 7 months, Elena said, quietly. "From when I left to when they were born, 7 months." Celeste looked at her. In Celeste's eyes was something that Elena couldn't fully categorize. Not guilt, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been living there a long time under the management and the polish and the careful arrangement. "I made a mistake," Celeste said. "A mistake," Roman repeated. "I was—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I was in a position that I couldn't see any other way out of. Roman, the way things were structured, with your father, with the succession, if you and Elena had—" She stopped again, started again. She was nobody. She was a paralegal from a firm we contracted, and your father was going to Don't bring my father into this. I'm trying to explain. I don't want an explanation. Roman stood up from the stool. He was taller than Celeste, and he used the height without drama, just the fact of it, the way the room rearranged itself around him when he stood. I want to understand exactly what you knew and when. Every detail. And I want you to say it in front of Elena, not to your lawyer, and not in a controlled environment where you can manage the frame. Right here. Celeste looked at Elena. Elena looked back. I found out she was pregnant, Celeste said finally. The room was very still. 2 weeks after she left, I found out. A mutual contact, someone at the clinic she'd visited in the city before she ran. Her voice had gone flat, the performance gone out of it entirely, leaving something that sounded exhausted and very old. I didn't tell Roman, I didn't. She paused. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that she'd chosen to go. Elena counted her own heartbeats. You knew, Elena said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. For 5 years and 10 months, you knew there were children. You knew, and you stood next to him at family dinners. You looked him in the face. Elena, you looked Miles in the face. The steadiness slipped just slightly on his name. She caught it, brought it back. If you'd ever come to this town, if you'd ever seen him, you would have known immediately. He is exactly... She stopped. The pressure in her chest, she breathed through it. He's exactly his father. Celeste was very still. Get out of my diner, Elena said. Celeste looked at Roman. You heard her, Roman said. Roman, I came here because there are people who know I've been withholding information about the succession, about the heir status, about Celeste. His voice was empty of everything. If you're about to tell me that someone else knows about my children, you need to choose your next words with extreme care. A beat. Victor Halen, Celeste said. Roman went absolutely still. Elena didn't know that name. She watched Roman's face process it, and whatever the processing produced was not good. His jaw tightened, that muscle in his cheek, and his eyes went to a place she recognized from the 2 years she'd known him as somewhere between cold calculation and the edge of something that didn't calculate at all. How? Roman said. He's been watching you. He's been watching the investigation. Roman, he has people in your infrastructure. He's known about Dre's Hollow for at least 3 weeks. Roman looked at Elena. The look lasted less than 2 seconds and communicated several things very clearly. This has changed. The situation is different now, and he needed her to understand that without asking him to explain it in front of Celeste. Elena understood it. She looked back at him and gave the smallest nod. Get out, Roman said to Celeste. Go to the Ashford house. Wait there. Don't contact anyone. His voice was quiet and absolute. If you contact Halen or anyone connected to him, I will consider that a declaration. Do you understand what that means? Celeste straightened. Something in her posture shifted. The polish went back on, an old habit, a survival mechanism. I understand. Then go. She went. The bell above the door rang. The door closed. Elena and Roman were alone in the diner with the rain on the windows and the weight of everything that had just been said lying across every flat surface. Elena picked up the coffee pot, set it back down. Victor Halen, she said. Rival operator. Roman's voice was still controlled, precise. He's been trying to find leverage against my organization for 3 years. He hasn't had any. Until me, Elena said. Until Miles and Mara. Roman looked at her. He knows about them, she said. Yes. He knows they're yours. Yes. She breathed through it. How dangerous is he? Significantly. Roman said it without hesitation, without softening, and she was grateful for that. She had no use for softening. He's not subtle. He's not patient. He will use the fastest and most direct leverage available to him. The twins, Elena said. Possibly. Roman. She waited until he looked at her. Not possibly. He held her gaze for a moment. Yes, he said. The twins. She turned around. went to the back door, stood with her hand on the frame, and looked out at the gravel lot and the cold November sea beyond it. The pale winter light on the water, the life she'd built in this town that had felt until recently like a sustainable distance from everything that wanted to destroy her. There was no sustainable distance. There had never been. She turned back around. How long do we have? I don't know. Best estimate. He was quiet for a moment. Days? Maybe less. She nodded, untied her apron, folded it, and laid it on the counter. I need to get my children from school, she said. I'll come with you. No. She looked at him. I need to do that alone. I need it to be normal for 10 more minutes, Roman. I need to pick them up and drive them home and have it be a normal afternoon for as long as I can make it that. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way he'd looked at Mara through the window, at Miles at the counter, with that particular intensity that had nowhere else to go. When you get back, he said, we talk. All of it. The whole picture. Yes. And Elena. His voice was quiet. You don't carry this alone anymore. That's done. That's finished right now. She looked at him. 6 years of doing exactly that. Carrying it, all of it, alone, every night, every morning, every fever and eviction notice and double shift, and the specific loneliness of being the only adult who knew the whole story. She picked up her keys. I'll be back in 40 minutes, she said. She walked out of the diner. The bell above the door rang behind her. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 30 seconds, both hands on the wheel, before she started the engine. 40 minutes of normal. That was what she was giving her children. Then everything was going to change. She pulled out of the lot, turned north toward the school, and didn't let herself look in the rearview mirror at the Cliff House, or the diner, or any piece of the life she'd spent 6 years building in the quiet. 20 minutes later, her phone rang. Mrs. Paulson's number. She answered immediately. Hello, Elena. Mrs. Paulson's voice was wrong. She was 73 and she had an unshakable quality, a steadiness that Elena had relied on, and her voice right now was not steady. Elena, I have to tell you something. Cold, down through her chest and into her stomach. Mrs. Paulson, the school called me 20 minutes ago. They said, a breath. They said someone came to pick up Miles and Mara. A woman. She showed a family authorization letter. Mrs. Paulson's voice broke, caught itself. Elena, the school let them go. They said the letter was notarized. They said... The road in front of Elena went white. Who? She said. The word came out wrong. Too quiet. Who was the woman? They didn't get a name. She came in a car and she... Elena, they're gone. They left 10 minutes ago and the school called them gone. Elena heard the words and her body made a decision before her mind did. She was already pulling a U-turn on the coastal road, tires skidding on the wet asphalt, the phone still against her ear with Mrs. Paulson's voice coming through it in fragments she couldn't fully process because her entire nervous system had narrowed to a single point. Her children were not where she had left them. Mrs. Paulson. Her voice surprised her. It was steady, clinical, operating on some emergency frequency that bypassed the thing happening in her chest. Which direction did the car go? Elena, I don't know. The school secretary said she watched them walk to the parking lot, but she didn't. What did the woman look like? Dark coat, dark hair. That's all they... She hung up, called Roman. He picked up on the first ring. Elena, they took them. The steadiness in her voice cracked on the last word. She swallowed it back. Celeste or Halen or both. A woman with a notarized letter picked them up from school 10 minutes ago. Dark coat, dark hair. A beat. Short, contained. And then Roman's voice came back and it had changed. Stripped down to something operational, something she'd heard in him once before, years ago, during a situation she hadn't been fully briefed on and had been grateful not to be. Where are you? Coastal Road heading back. 2 minutes from the diner. Come to the Cliff House, not the diner. Don't stop. Roman, Elena, come to the Cliff House. His voice was absolute. I have people here. We find them faster together. She pressed the accelerator down and drove. The Ashford mansion sat on a bluff above the sea, accessed by a private gravel road through overgrown pines. She'd only seen it from a distance before. The kind of structure that announces its own history in the way it sat on the land, large and neglected and built for a different century. Up close, in the gray November afternoon, it was half-renovated chaos. Scaffolding on the east face, new windows not yet installed on the upper story, but inside it was operational in the way a military command post was operational. Functional before beautiful, purposeful. There were two men in the front room she didn't know. Large, quiet, professional, in the specific way that had nothing to do with civilian work. They looked at her, and then at Roman, who had come to the door before she'd fully parked. She got out of the car, and he was already walking toward her, and she saw in his face the same thing she was feeling, terror running under control, the way lava ran under stone, present and total, and contained by sheer force of will. "Tell me everything," he said. Exactly what Mrs. Paulson said. She told him. All of it, every word, standing in the cold gravel with the sea behind the house, and the wind coming off it, and her arms wrapped around herself because she had left her coat in the diner and she couldn't make herself care. Roman listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned to the nearer of the two men. Older, short gray hair, a face that had the particular blankness of someone who'd learned not to express things in front of clients. "Keller, pull all traffic camera coverage on the school radius, 20-minute window starting 40 minutes ago. Every exit." "Already on it," Keller said, and moved. The other man, younger, was on a phone in the corner speaking in low, rapid sentences that Elena couldn't follow. Roman put his hand on her arm, not holding her, just contact, the warmth of it, a specific kind of anchoring. "They're not going to hurt them," he said. "Not yet. Not while they need leverage." "That's supposed to comfort me. It's supposed to be accurate." His jaw was tight. "Halen needs something from me. That's the entire point of this. He won't damage what he needs me to want back." Elena looked at him. "How sure are you?" A pause. 1 second. "Sure enough to tell you instead of the other version." She understood what he meant. The other version was that Victor Halen was unpredictable, and her children were 5 years old, and leverage had a shelf life, and none of that was something she was permitted to say out loud right now. She breathed it in and breathed it back out, and looked at the room instead of his face. "Where's Celeste?" she said. Roman's expression went flat. "Roman." She turned to face him fully. "Where is she?" "She was supposed to wait here?" He said it without looking away from her, and in his voice was a specific quality. Not surprise, not quite. More like something he'd suspected and had been hoping wouldn't be confirmed. "She's not here." Elena stared at him. "She left 20 minutes ago," the younger man said from the corner, phone lowered now. "Her car went south on Route 9. My man lost her at the junction." The room rearranged itself. Elena felt it happen. The specific, physical sensation of a structure she'd been building and rebuilding in her head collapsing along a load-bearing wall she hadn't known was compromised. She'd been working with a version of events. Celeste had staged the original betrayal. Halen had found out about the twins. Celeste had come to the diner in a panic. Two separate threats converging. But Celeste had left 20 minutes ago. The twins had been taken 20 minutes ago. "She called them," Elena said. Roman said nothing. "She didn't come to warn me." The cold in Elena's chest was not fear anymore. It was something more refined, more dangerous. She came to assess. She came to see how much we knew and what we were going to do about it, and then she called Halen and told him to move. "Yes," Roman said. "She told you she was scared. She told us both what we needed to hear." His voice was very quiet. "That's what she does. That's what she's always done. She manages the frame." He exhaled through his nose. "I underestimated how far she was already in with Halen. I knew she'd been talking to him. I knew she'd been—" He stopped, a muscle in his jaw. "I should have moved faster." "Don't!" Elena said it sharply. He looked at her. "We're not doing that right now. Save it." Something in his face shifted. He nodded once. Keller came back from the far room with a tablet, the screen showing grainy traffic camera footage. A dark SUV, footage time-stamped at 3:24 p.m., turning east out of the school district onto the main highway corridor. "Plates are cloned," Keller said. "Registered to a rental company in the city. Car was reported stolen 2 days ago. Pre-planned." Pre-planned. Elena absorbed that. They'd prepared the notarized letter, cloned the plates, had a car in position. This had not been improvised in the last hour after Celeste left the diner. This had been in motion before Celeste ever walked into the diner. Celeste hadn't come to warn them, or assess, or manage. She'd come to delay. How long did she give them? Elena said. By coming to talk to us. How much time did she buy them? Keller and Roman exchanged a look. 2 hours, Keller said. Maybe 3, if we didn't start moving immediately. 2 hours. Enough time to get the children somewhere secure, somewhere Roman's people couldn't reach with a phone call, somewhere that required a different kind of response. Elena sat down in the nearest chair, not because she needed to, because she needed to do something deliberate with her body before it did something involuntary. She sat, and she put her hands flat on her knees, and she breathed through her nose, and she looked at the far wall. Miles. The way he'd watched Roman at the counter this morning with those careful gray eyes, the dinosaur shirt with the mustard stain, Mara, her 2 uneven pigtails, the authority in her voice telling Roman he should have had an umbrella. She breathed. Tell me about Victor Halen, she said. Everything. Roman pulled a chair across from her and sat, not to put himself at her eye level, but because it was going to be a long answer, and he wasn't going to stand over her while he gave it. She noticed that, filed it. He runs a consolidated operation on the eastern seaboard, Roman said. Has for 12 years. He's efficient, and he's brutal when he needs to be, and he's been trying to expand west into my territory for 3 years. He's made offers. They've been declined. A pause. He doesn't take decline well. He's been looking for a way to apply enough pressure that I'd negotiate rather than fight. And my children are pressure. His people have been watching me for months. They found the investigation, my investigation into your disappearance. They followed it to Dre's Hollow. They figured out the rest. His voice was flat, factual, not apologetic. If he threatens my children, he knows I'll negotiate to keep them safe. He knows I'd agree to things I'd never agree to otherwise. What does he want? Territory, routes, infrastructure. Roman looked at her. Effectively, half my organization. And if you give it to him, then I'm weakened enough that the rest collapses within a year. He knows that too. That's the design. Elena looked at her hands on her knees. So he's not negotiating, he's dismantling. Yes. And Celeste. She looked up. What does she get? Roman was quiet for a moment. She's been promised a position. In his structure, not mine. She's been working toward his side for... He stopped. I don't know how long. Keller is finding out. Keller, across the room, didn't look up from his screen. 14 months, he said. 14 months. Elena registered that in her chest like a physical impact. 14 months ago was when Roman had found out where she was. He'd said it himself, sitting at the counter with his coffee. I found you 14 months ago. Celeste had been working with Halen for 14 months, which meant, she's known about you finding me, Elena said, this whole time. Yes. She's been managing him and you simultaneously. She knew you'd come eventually. She was... Elena stopped, worked through it. She was waiting for you to make contact, waiting for you to surface publicly enough that Halen could confirm the twins existed. Then she walked into the diner today to confirm what Halen's people had already told him, and to stall. Roman looked at her in a way that had something in it she didn't have time to examine, something about the way she'd laid it out, quick and cold and accurate. Yes, he said. She's been patient, Elena said. She played all of us very patiently for a very long time. Yes. A pause. She learned it somewhere. He didn't say from whom. He didn't need to. Elena stood up. The chair scraped back. She walked to the window that faced the sea and looked at it. The gray water, the white caps, the November light going flat as the afternoon aged. Your phone, she said. What? Halen will call you. He's been watching your investigation for months. He knows you're here. He knows we've made contact. He'll call. She turned around. When he does, what's his opening? He'll want a meeting. Where? Somewhere he controls. He'll name it. And you'll go. Roman looked at her. Elena, you'll go, she said, and I'm going with you. That is not... They're my children. Her voice didn't rise. It went lower, which was worse. They're 5 years old, and they've been taken by a man who uses them as currency. And I have spent 6 years being the adult in the room for every hard thing, every scary thing, everything there was no one else to face. I am not sitting in this house while you walking into that situation is not negotiable. She looked at him. I am going. What you need to decide is whether we go prepared or whether I go alone. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, Keller and the younger man had gone very still, the way people went still when they understood that the room had a center of gravity and it wasn't them. Roman's phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. They both looked at it. Roman picked it up, put it on speaker, set it on the table between them. Where, he said. A pause. Then a voice. Male, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who'd been told his whole life that he was the most important person in any room. I see you finally made it to the coast. How's the view? Tell me what you want, Helen. I want a conversation, the kind that fixes problems. A pause, calibrated for effect. You have problems. I have solutions. You have something I want. I have something you want. Standard arrangement. My children are not an arrangement. Roman, the first name used, deliberate, the small assertion of false intimacy. I'm a reasonable man. The kids are fine. They had dinner. Well, it's a little early for dinner, but they had snacks. The little girl is extremely opinionated about snacks, by the way, and the boy, a pause. The boy doesn't talk much, but he watches everything. Smart kid. Elena's hands were fists at her sides. She was looking at Roman's face, and Roman's face was a wall. Absolutely nothing on the outside, everything happening somewhere behind it that only showed in the flatness of his eyes. What do you want? Roman said. I want to meet. Tomorrow night. I'll send the location. Another pause. Bring the mother. She should be part of this conversation. She's been part of the equation long enough. And Roman, his voice dropped slightly. Don't bring an army. Bring your people. I'll have mine. We keep it civilized. You do something uncivilized, the arrangement for the kids becomes less comfortable. You understand? The line went dead. Roman set the phone down. The room was very quiet, except for the wind off the sea and the distant sound of scaffolding moving against the east face of the house. Elena looked at the phone, then at Roman. He wants you to negotiate, she said. He wants you to sit across from him and give him what he wants while your children are somewhere in that building and you can hear them but not reach them. Yes, he's going to use them as ambient threat. He's not going to touch them. He's going to make sure you can see them, can hear them, and he's going to ask for things while that's happening. Roman said nothing. He was looking at the phone with the particular expression of a man who had run every calculation and arrived at an answer he didn't like. You can't give him what he wants, Elena said. You told me if you give him half the organization, the rest collapses. That's not an outcome. That's just a slower version of losing everything. I know. So you're not negotiating? No. Then what happens at that meeting? Roman looked at her. For the first time since she'd arrived, since the phone call, since the traffic camera footage, since Helen's voice coming through the speaker with her daughter's snack preferences in his mouth, for the first time, Roman's face did something that wasn't control. It was brief. A second, maybe two. Something raw and heavy and very old passing through him, the way grief passed through rooms sometimes, not announcing itself, just present and massive and then contained again behind the wall. At that meeting, he said, I go in knowing exactly where my children are, knowing every exit, knowing every person in that building, and then I take them back. That's not a negotiation, Elena said. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man she had loved and lost and spent 6 years believing was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. At this man whose eyes were in her children's faces and whose patience and precision had apparently been put to the work of finding her, quietly, without announcement, for over a year. Then tell me what I need to do, she said. Specifically, what role, what position, what I need to know walking in. He looked at her. Roman. Her voice was quiet. I told you I'm not running anymore. I meant it. Tell me. He held her gaze. Something settled in him. She could see it, the specific quality of a decision made, a threshold crossed. Sit down, he said. This is going to take a while. She sat. Outside, the November sea moved against the cliff with the indifferent regularity of things that have no investment in human outcomes. The wind found the gaps in the scaffolding and made a low, continuous sound. In a warehouse somewhere east of here, in a building with fluorescent lights and the smell of salt water and concrete, her daughter was being opinionated about snacks, and her son was watching everything with Roman's careful gray eyes. And both of them were waiting, in the way children wait when they have been raised by someone who taught them that fear was just an obstacle you breathe through. Elena was going to walk into whatever room held them. She was going to walk in alongside the man she'd run from 6 years ago. And this time, for the first time in 6 years, for the first time since a lie collapsed her world and she'd driven north until she couldn't feel the wreckage anymore, she was not going to be the only adult in the room facing the hardest thing. Roman spread a site map on the table between them. An abandoned shipping complex on the Eastern Harbor Road, 3 buildings, 2 access points, a loading dock facing the water. He began to talk, and Elena leaned forward and listened and began to become something she had not been before. Not a woman running, not a woman hiding, not a woman surviving alone in the crater of someone else's lie, but a woman walking, eyes open, into the fire, because the fire had her children and she was done standing at a distance from the things that wanted to destroy her. Roman looked up from the map and found her eyes. "You said," he said quietly, "that you were going to find out the true thing about that night, and then decide what happened next." "Yes. This is what happens next." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. And outside, the light was failing over Dre's Hollow, and the cliff house stood above it all, lit and operational, and full of people who were about to stop waiting and start moving. And in the back of Elena's chest, under the terror and the fury and the 6 years of accumulated weight, something that had been folded very small for a very long time was quietly, dangerously opening. They didn't sleep. There was no pretense of it. Elena sat at the table in the cliff house with the site map and Roman's notes and a cup of coffee that went cold at her elbow, and she memorized the layout of the warehouse complex the way she'd once memorized case files, methodically, without sentiment, building the spatial logic of it in her head until she could close her eyes and walk through it. 2 main structures. The eastern building was the operational one, loading dock, ground floor, interior office space on a mezzanine level overlooking the floor. That was where Halen would be. That was where he'd want to stand, elevated, looking down. Men like Halen always wanted elevation. The children would be in the secondary structure. Not with Halen. He'd keep them close enough to be credible leverage, far enough that Roman couldn't reach them in a single movement. There was a connector corridor between the buildings, 12 feet, a fire door on each end. She memorized the fire doors. Roman was on the phone for most of the night, speaking in low, precise sentences to people she didn't know, coordinating things she wasn't fully briefed on and didn't ask to be fully briefed on because she understood the principle. The less she knew about the operational specifics, the more freely she could move within them. She knew her role. She knew the layout. She knew that her job was not to fight Roman's war. Her job was to reach the fire door. At 4 a.m., she found him standing at the north window, looking at the dark sea. She stood next to him, not touching, just occupying the same rectangle of darkness. "Miles is going to be angry at me," she said. Roman looked at her. "For not telling him sooner." She looked at the water. "About who you are. He's going to be angry at me for keeping it. He'll understand when he's older. That's not the point. He shouldn't have to wait until he's older to have his anger validated." She exhaled. "I should have told him. Before any of this, I should have—" "Elena." Roman's voice was quiet. "You protected them. Everything you did was protection." "I know. That doesn't mean it was all right." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She appreciated that. The refusal to make it simple. They stood at the window until the sky changed. Halen's location came through at 6 a.m. A text to Roman's phone, an address on the Eastern Harbor Road, confirmation of what the site map had already shown. 8 p.m. 2 vehicles maximum. Roman read it and set the phone down. "He's not changing the location," Elena said. "No, he was always going to use the warehouse. He's had it for years. It's his infrastructure. His people know every corner. He wants terrain advantage." "Then we take away the terrain advantage." Roman looked at her. How? We go in early. She'd been building this since 2 a.m., and she laid it out now, clean and direct. Not at 8. We go at 6, before he expects movement. His people will be in position, but they won't be at full alert. They'll be in the setup phase. Keller's team goes in through the loading dock on the water side while the main attention is on the road entrance. We don't announce. We don't call ahead. We arrive and we are already inside before he understands the geometry has changed. Roman looked at the map, looked at her. You've done this before, he said. I've read enough case law to understand how people get caught. She met his eyes. And I've spent 6 years thinking about every version of this conversation. Some part of me knew it was coming. Some part of me was always waiting. He held her gaze. Then he looked at Keller, who had been present and quiet for most of the night. Keller nodded. It's possible. We'd need eyes inside first. Confirm where the kids are before we move. Do it, Roman said. The day was interminable. Elena went to the diner at 8 to keep the appearance of normalcy. Dee opened the door and took one look at her face and said nothing, made coffee, and ran the morning shift without asking a single question. Elena sat in the back room where her children should have been, with their coloring books and their tablet and Mara's half-finished drawing of a horse with 6 legs on the table, and she sat very still for 11 minutes before she was able to stand up and go back to work. Dee brought her coffee at 10. They're going to be fine, Dee said. Elena looked at her. I don't know what's happening, Dee said. And I'm not asking, but I know you. And I know the man who's been leaving $100 bills on my counter for a week. She set the coffee down. Whatever you're walking into tonight, you're not doing it as the same woman who came to this town 6 years ago. Elena looked at the coffee. Who am I doing it as? Dee thought about it. Someone who stopped running. Elena picked up the coffee. Close the diner at 3, she said. Take the day. Dee didn't argue. Keller's inside man confirmed at 4 p.m. The twins were in the secondary structure, a small interior room on the ground floor, 2 guards on the door. Mara was apparently directing one of the guards to play a hand-clapping game she'd invented. Miles was sitting with his back against the wall, watching the exits. Elena received this information standing in the cliff house with Roman beside her. She listened to Keller read it. She nodded. She went to the bathroom, ran cold water over her wrists, looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Not performing anything, not managing anything, just looking. You stopped running, Dee had said. The woman in the mirror looked older than she'd expected, and steadier. She turned off the tap and went back to the room. They left at 6, 3 vehicles, Roman, Elena, and Keller in the lead vehicle. 2 additional teams in the vehicles behind taking different routes, converging on the waterside approach while Roman's car went to the road entrance. The plan was not elegant. It was direct, which was different. The plan relied on speed and the element of 2 hours advantage and the specific quality of Roman's people, who had been selected and trained for exactly the kind of situation where elegance was a liability. Elena sat in the front passenger seat. The harbor road ran alongside the water, the sea black in the evening, the salt smell coming through the vents. She had a phone in her coat pocket with Keller's direct line. She had memorized the fire doors. She had, at Roman's insistence and over her initial objection, a small fixed-blade knife in her boot. Not because anyone expected her to use it, but because Roman had said, I need you to have something, and she'd understood that the something was less about the blade than about the psychological fact of not being entirely unarmed. She understood that. Roman drove. He drove the way he did everything, with complete attention and no wasted movement. His jaw was set. His hands were exactly right on the wheel. He was already somewhere inside the building in his head, she knew, running the sequence, adjusting. When we're inside, he said, not looking at her, you go for the connector. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. I know. If the fire door on your side is blocked, there's a window on the south wall, ground level, 3 feet wide. I know. He looked at her briefly, looked back at the road. After you have them, he said, you go to the water side. Keller will have a vehicle on the dock. Roman. What? I know the plan. She looked at the road ahead. Stop managing it. We both know what we're doing. A beat. Then quietly, yes. They drove. The warehouse complex sat on a jut of the eastern harbor, separated from the main dock infrastructure by a chain-link fence and 200 yards of cracked asphalt. From the road it looked abandoned, which it was, mostly, except for the two vehicles parked at the loading bay entrance and the light leaking around the edges of the eastern building's loading door. Roman parked on the road shoulder, 60 yards out. He looked at his phone. A text from Keller. Water team in position. He looked at Elena. She was already looking at the building, mapping it against the image she'd built in her head. There, the loading bay entrance, two men visible even from 60 yards, standing with the specific stance of people who were guarding something and knew it. There, the narrow alley between the two structures, darker than the surrounding asphalt, where the connector corridor would be. There, a light in the secondary structure's ground floor window. Her children were behind that light. She put her hand on the door handle. Elena. Roman's voice. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and for a moment neither of them managed a controlled expression. It was just two people in a car in the dark, both terrified, both committed to not showing it, both understanding exactly what it meant that they were here together. Come back, she said. His jaw moved. That's the plan. She got out of the car. The cold hit immediately. Salt air and harbor smell, and the specific November dark of a coastal night with no moon. She moved along the fence line, keeping to the shadow, the gravel silent under her shoes. Behind her she heard Roman's door, and then nothing. He moved without sound when he needed to, another thing she'd half forgotten about him. 60 yards became 40, became 20. The two guards at the loading bay hadn't moved, hadn't looked left. Then, from inside, a sound, muffled through the corrugated steel walls, but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent 5 years learning to hear it through apartment walls and diner kitchens, and the specific acoustic of a child who had been told no. Mara, arguing about something. Elena exhaled. Alive, present, opinionated. She turned right into the alley between the buildings. The connector corridor fire door was unlocked. That was wrong. It should have been locked. Keller's man had said it was locked from the inside, and it wasn't. She stopped with her hand on the handle and looked at the gap, the darkness of the interior beyond it. Unlocked door. Could be a guard who'd propped it. Could be something else. She went through anyway. Boom. The corridor was 12 feet of concrete and flickering fluorescent light, one tube half dead and buzzing, casting everything in the pale, sickly quality of institutional spaces. She could hear better in here. Voices, two of them, male, on the other side of the far fire door. Guards. The ones Keller's man had flagged. She was 6 feet from her children. She put her back against the wall, pulled out the phone, texted Keller. At the fire door, two guards inside, confirm. 10 seconds. Confirmed. My man can take the eastern guard in 40 seconds on your go. She looked at the door. 40 seconds was a long time. Then the door opened from the inside. She had half a second, less, and she pressed back into the deepest shadow of the corridor wall, the bad fluorescent light working in her favor for once, the flicker creating enough visual noise that the guard who came through the door was looking at his phone and not at the walls. He walked past her. She held her breath. He went out the far end of the corridor. She went through the door. The room was small, a former foreman's office, maybe 200 square feet, industrial shelving on one wall, the overhead light harsh and bare, a card table in the center with a box of crackers and 2 juice boxes, a space heater in the corner doing inadequate work. Miles was against the far wall with his knees up and his eyes on the door. On her, the moment she came through it, his whole body reading the situation before she'd said a word. Mara was mid-sentence to the remaining guard, a young man who looked like he'd drawn the short straw on tonight's assignment and was now being comprehensively lectured on the structural flaws of the hand-clapping game they'd apparently been playing. "Mom," Miles said. Not a cry, not a sob, just the word, flat and certain. The specific tone of someone who had been waiting and was now done waiting. Mara turned around. "Mom!" And then she was across the room and Elena had her, the weight of her, the warm, solid fact of her daughter against her chest, Mara's arms going around her neck with the full force of a 5-year-old who had been scared and was not admitting it. The guard stood up, Elena looked at him over Mara's head. Don't, she said. He was young, 23, maybe 24. He looked at her and at the children and at the door and made a calculation that had more to do with self-preservation than loyalty. He sat back down. Miles walked to her. He didn't run. He walked, and he put his hand in hers, and he looked up at her with those gray eyes and said nothing. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. She typed one hand into Keller. I have them, moving to dock. Then the building shook. Not violently, not an explosion, not structural. A concussive thud from the eastern building, through the connecting wall, the sound of something going wrong at speed. She heard voices, raised, and then a sustained crash of equipment or furniture, and then the specific sound of men moving fast in a space not designed for it. Roman was in the building. She looked at the south wall window, 3 feet wide, ground level, exactly where she'd memorized it. Miles, she said, can you get through that window? He looked at it. Yes. Mara first. You help her. I'm right behind you. Miles moved to the window without drama. He was 5 years old, and he moved with the practical efficiency of someone who had been raised to understand that when his mother used that voice, you did the thing and processed the feelings later. He got the latch, pushed it open, helped his sister through with a competence that was startling and heartbreaking in equal measure. Then he looked back at Elena. Go, she said. He went. She went through after him, the window frame catching her shoulder, the cold asphalt of the exterior coming up fast under her hands as she landed. She was on her feet in a second, one hand on Miles, the other taking Mara's hand from her son, and she moved, along the building's south face, toward the water, toward the dock where Keller's vehicle was supposed to be waiting. Behind her, from inside the eastern building, she heard Roman's voice. Not calling to her, not words she could make out. Just the specific register of Roman Vare giving instructions in a situation that had stopped following a script. She did not stop. She did not look back. She ran. Boo. The dock was 40 yards from the south face of the building. 40 yards of cracked asphalt and coiled rope, and the smell of brine and diesel. A black SUV with its lights off, engine running. Keller's man at the wheel, a second person in the back who she didn't know and didn't need to. She got the twins in, climbed in after them. The door closed. Go? Keller's man asked. No. She looked at the eastern building. Wait. Ma'am, the protocol is, Wait, she said. Mara had her face pressed against Elena's shoulder. Miles was sitting up straight in the seat, looking out the window at the building, his jaw set in a way that was so specifically Roman, it took her breath away. 40 seconds passed. 60. Then the eastern building's loading door opened. Roman came out first. Moving fast but not running, controlled urgency, the walk of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Behind him, 2 of his men. Behind them, Victor Halen, walking, not being carried, which told her the situation had resolved itself short of the worst versions. And behind Halen, her hands in front of her, brought by the third of Roman's men, Celeste. Celeste, who had planned this, who had delayed them in the diner, who had called the signal that sent 2 men to a school with a notarized letter and took 5-year-old children from a building they'd been safe in and put them in a warehouse as instruments of someone else's ambition. Roman reached the SU-5. He opened the door. He saw the twins, saw them, both of them, present and unharmed, Miles's grave face and Mara's tear-tracked one. And something happened in his face that Elena had never seen on it before. Something that was not controlled and did not try to be. Something that lasted 3 seconds before he closed it back down because there were still men behind him and a situation still requiring management. He reached in and put his hand briefly, very briefly, on Miles's head. Miles didn't pull away. Roman straightened, turned back to face Halen, who had stopped 15 feet from the vehicles with the specific expression of a man recalibrating his position. Victor Halen was broad, late 40s, with a face that had been broken and reset at least once. He looked at Roman and at the SUV with the children in it and at the dock behind them, and he understood the geometry. The water team had the dock. Roman's men had the exit. The inside of the warehouse behind him was no longer his. My family, Roman said, is not currency. Halen looked at him. He was recalculating.
She could see it, the rapid reassessment of available leverage, finding none. He looked at Celeste, who was looking at the ground. "You're walking away from a reasonable offer," Halen said. His voice was still managed, still performing the fiction of control. "I'm walking away from a threat." Roman's voice was flat and cold and completely without theater. "There's a difference. You confuse the two." "Where?"
We're done talking. Roman turned away. The dismissal was total and deliberate. The act of a man who has decided that the person behind him no longer exists in any operational sense. He opened the driver's door of the SUV. Halen's jaw tightened. "This isn't finished." Roman stopped. He turned back, just slightly, just enough to make eye contact. "For you," he said quietly, "it is." He got in the car. Keller's man pulled forward along the dock. Behind them, Elena watched through the rear window as Roman's men maintained their positions around Helen with the patient, geometric precision of a conclusion being enforced. Celeste raised her head. Through the rear window, their eyes met. Elena looked at her, at the woman who had taken 6 years from her, taken a pregnancy from its father, taken 2 children's first 5 years from a man who would have given everything to be present for them. And she felt, in the place where the 6 years of accumulated grief lived, something harden into clarity. Not rage. Rage burned too hot to last. Something colder. Something that would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and as long as it needed to be. She turned away from the window. Mara had fallen asleep against her arm in the space of 4 minutes, the abrupt total crash of a child whose nervous system has finally been given permission to stand down. Miles was still upright, still watching out the window at the retreating lights of the warehouse. "Miles," Elena said. He looked at her. "I'm going to explain everything," she said, "as soon as we're home. All of it. You deserve to know." He looked at her for a long moment with those riverstone eyes. "I know who he is," Miles said. Elena was quiet. "He's my dad." Miles said it the way he'd said "he has my eyes," as observable fact, the clean acknowledgement of a thing that had been true regardless of whether it had been named. "I figured it out." A pause. "I'm not mad." She looked at her son, at the 5-year-old who had spent an afternoon in a warehouse with strangers and emerged from it with his spine straight and his eyes clear and his understanding of the world revised and already integrated. "You will be mad," she said, "later, when you've had time to think about it, and that's okay." Miles considered this. Was it his fault that we didn't know him? The question she'd been circling for 2 days. The question she'd been circling for 6 years, really, without knowing it was this question specifically. "No," she said, "it wasn't his fault." Miles nodded once, looked back out the window. The dock lights fell behind them. The sea opened up on the left, black and wide, and the coastal road ran north toward Dre's Hollow, toward the small house with original windows and the radiator that banged and the kitchen that faced the water. Mara breathed against Elena's arm. Miles watched the dark. And in the vehicle behind them, Roman Veyer drove with both hands on the wheel and the specific stillness of a man who has just recovered something he didn't know how to survive losing, heading toward a conversation with his children that he had no preparation for and no ability to avoid, and would not, for anything remaining to him in the world. They got home at 9:30, the small house with original windows and the banging radiator and the kitchen that faced the sea. Elena unlocked the front door, and the familiar smell of it came out. Coffee and wood and the specific warmth of a place that had been lived in hard and carefully. And Mara walked straight to the couch and lay down and was asleep again in 40 seconds, still in her coat, one shoe half off. Miles stood in the entryway and looked at the house like he was checking it against a memory, making sure it was still the same, making sure the thing that had happened hadn't changed the geometry of the place he knew. Elena crouched down and took his face in her hands. "We're home," she said. He looked at her. Then he nodded. Then he went to his room, and she heard the specific sound of him getting into bed. The mattress, the blanket pulled, the small settling of a child finding his position, and then silence. She stood in the entryway alone. Roman was still outside. She'd seen his headlights in the drive. She'd known he would follow, and she'd said nothing to stop it. And now she stood in her own entryway in her coat and thought about what came next, which was everything. which was the whole unresolved weight of 6 years, plus 2 days, plus whatever Victor Halen was going to do next, plus whatever Celeste was, plus the conversation with Miles that was going to happen tomorrow, and had already half happened in the back of a car on a dark coastal road. She went back outside. Roman was standing at the edge of the drive, looking at the sea. The wind was off the water, cold and direct, and he hadn't turned his collar up against it. Just standing in it, absorbing it. She stood beside him. "Halen," she said, "is being managed." His voice was even. "He's not in a position to move against me. Not tonight, not this month. What happened at the warehouse, the way it resolved, that sends a message in the community he operates in. You don't attempt leverage and fail and retain your credibility." A pause. "He's done. Not gone, but done as a threat. You're sure?" "Sure enough." She looked at the water. "And Celeste?" Roman was quiet for a moment. A long one. "She's in custody. My custody, not a legal one. She'll be moved tomorrow to a facility outside the city. Private, secure, therapeutic." He said the last word without irony, which surprised her. "She'll have access to medical care and treatment. She won't have access to a phone or anyone connected to my world or yours." "For how long?" "As long as it takes." His jaw moved. "She's my family. That's the only reason she's not in a worse situation." Elena looked at his profile, the line of it in the dark. "You're angry that you still care." He looked at the water. "Yes. That's not a flaw. It feels like one." "It's not." She pulled her coat tighter. "People who stop caring become something worse. You know that." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. They stood for a while without speaking. The sea made its sound, that particular rhythm that had become the background of her life here, the constant peripheral presence she'd stopped hearing consciously and now couldn't imagine not having. It had kept her company in its indifferent way through 6 years of nights she hadn't had anyone to stand next to. "She knew," Elena said. "Celeste, from the beginning. She knew what she was doing to me wasn't just hurt feelings. She knew I was pregnant and she let me run anyway, and then she kept that from you for 6 years." She kept her voice level. "I can make peace with the original act, the lie she staged. I can understand the mechanics of it. Jealousy, ambition, the position she wanted. I can build a picture of how a person does something like that." She paused. "What I can't build a picture of is the years. Every time she looked at you and knew. Every family dinner, every conversation about my disappearance where she managed your grief and kept her version intact." She exhaled. "That's not a mistake. That's a choice, made every morning for 6 years." "I know," Roman said. "So when you say family, I know what she is." His voice was quiet and final. "She's family, which is why I didn't kill her. She's also someone who made a choice every morning for 6 years. Both things are true and neither one changes the other." Elena looked at him. "That's a hard thing to live with," she said. "Yes." He looked back at the water. "I've been living with hard things for a while, Chateauitso." She made tea she didn't drink, standing at the kitchen window, watching the drive. Roman had said goodnight at the door. Not coming in, not pushing, just standing in the frame for a moment with the specific quality of a man who understood the concept of earning and intended to apply it. "Tomorrow," he'd said. "Can I come in the morning?" She'd looked at him. "Miles is going to have questions." "I know. I can't predict what he'll ask." "I'm not asking you to predict it." He'd looked at her steadily. "I'm asking to be there for it, whatever it is." She'd said yes. She'd stood at the window and watched his lights pull out of the drive and disappear toward the cliff road, and she'd made tea, and she was standing here now in the kitchen that faced the sea, and she was doing something she hadn't done in 6 years. She was not dreading tomorrow. She was tired. She was shaky in the specific post-adrenaline way that didn't announce itself until the crisis was over and the body remembered it had been running on empty for 36 hours. Her shoulder hurt where she'd caught the window frame coming through it. Her hands, when she held them up in the kitchen light, had a faint tremor. But the dread, the low, constant, familiar dread that had lived in her chest since the night she'd driven north and north and north, was not there. In its place was something quieter and more complicated and not entirely named. She drank her tea, went to check on her children. Mara had been moved from the couch to her bed at some point. She'd slept through the transfer, which was a feat she'd always been capable of, a deep and total surrender to sleep that Elena had always envied. She was on her side now, with her mouth slightly open and her two uneven pigtails crushed against the pillow. Elena fixed the blanket. Miles was awake. He was lying on his back with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling in the way of someone doing serious internal processing, and when she appeared in the doorway, he turned his head. "Can't sleep?" she said. "I'm thinking." She came in, sat on the edge of his bed. "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. "About whether I'm supposed to be sad. About the warehouse? About what happened today? About all of it." He looked at the ceiling. About him. About the years before. His voice was matter-of-fact, the way it always was when he was working through something large. He didn't dramatize Miles, he analyzed, and the analysis looked almost calm from the outside, which was one of the things that kept her up some nights. "Other kids have dads. I always knew I didn't. I wasn't sad about it because it was just how things were." He paused. "But now I know there was supposed to be one. So I'm trying to figure out if I'm sad about the time we didn't have, or if it's too early to know." Elena looked at her son. "It's okay not to know yet," she said. "You don't have to sort all of it tonight." "I know." He shifted, pulled his blanket straighter. "Is he going to leave again?" "He doesn't want to." "But will he?" She looked at him directly. "I don't know the answer to that yet. What I know is that he came here because he wanted to find us. And he stayed. And tonight, when it mattered, he came." She paused. "The rest is something we all figure out together." Miles considered this with the gravity of a very small, very serious person. "I don't want you to be sad anymore," he said. She stopped breathing for a moment. "I've seen you," he said simply, "when you think we're asleep." She looked at him. "I'm not sad," she said. Then because he deserved better than that. "Not the same kind. Not anymore." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the ceiling. "Okay," he said. "Good night, Mom." She kissed his forehead. He accepted it in the way he accepted affection. Briefly, warmly, with dignity. She turned off his light and went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a long time, and the tremor in her hands gradually stilled. Roman came at 8. He knocked, which she hadn't expected. She'd imagined he'd simply arrive, the way he'd always moved through spaces, as if arrival were a given. But he knocked and waited. And when she opened the door, he was standing on the step with 2 coffees from the gas station on Route 9, because the diner was closed and it was the only place open this early. She took one. He came in. Mara was at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, still in her pajamas, her pigtails completely destroyed by sleep. She looked at Roman across the kitchen with the frank, unblinking assessment she'd been applying to him since the first day. "You came back," she said. "Yes," Roman said. "Why do you always have black coffee?" She said it with the specific offense of someone deeply invested in the concept of added sugar. "Coffee is better with stuff in it." Roman looked at the gas station cup in his hand. "I'll consider that." "You should." Mara returned to her cereal with the conclusiveness of someone who has made their position clear. Miles appeared from the hallway. He was dressed, which meant he'd been up for a while. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Roman. Roman looked back. The kitchen was quiet, except for the cereal sounds, and the radiator, and the sea through the window. Miles came to the table and sat down across from Mara. He put both hands flat on the table surface and looked at them, and then at Roman, and then he said, "Are you staying in Dre's Hollow?" "That's my plan," Roman said. "Why?" "Because my family is here." Miles absorbed this. His expression did something careful and then settled. He was 5, and he understood that this was an enormous sentence and he was going to need time with it. And the time was going to start now and continue for years. And that was acceptable. "Okay," he said. Elena stood at the counter with her gas station coffee and looked at the kitchen. Her children at the table, the sea through the window. This man who had walked into her diner in the rain and blown open the door she'd kept shut for 6 years. And she felt the weight of the last 6 years and the weight of the last 2 days simultaneously, like 2 coats worn on top of each other, heavy and insulating and eventually too warm. She set down the coffee. Roman, she said. He looked at her. Sit down. He sat down at the table with her children. He sat in the chair that had been empty for 6 years, the one she'd always told herself they didn't need. The fourth chair she kept at the table because the table had come with 4, and she'd never bothered to put one in storage. She looked at that for a moment. Then she sat down too. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Not the whole 2 hours. Not in words. Some of it was Mara explaining in extraordinary detail the hand-clapping game she'd invented and the deficiencies in the guard's execution of it. Some of it was Miles asking questions in that methodical way of his, one at a time, waiting for the full answer before asking the next, building a picture piece by piece with the patience of an engineer. Some of it was silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just present, people sharing a room and a table, and the specific gravity of a morning that was reorganizing something fundamental. Roman answered every question Miles asked. He didn't simplify. He didn't perform. When Miles asked why he hadn't known about them, he said that someone had made sure he didn't, and that he was sorry. And that sorry was not enough, but it was what he had. Miles nodded and asked his next question. When Mara asked if he was going to live in the scary house on the cliff, he said yes, unless they found somewhere better. And Mara said the house wasn't scary, it was just old. And Roman said that was probably true of most things. Elena watched Roman with her children and felt something move in her that she'd been keeping very still. She'd spent 6 years being afraid of what she felt for him. Afraid of it because it had nearly destroyed her, because the believing had made the loss catastrophic, because she'd learned the hard way that loving someone capable of causing that much damage was its own particular kind of recklessness. But he hadn't caused it. That was the thing she was still integrating, still turning over and examining from different angles. He hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't rejected her. He hadn't said she wasn't enough. That was the lie Celeste had needed her to believe. The story that would make her run and keep running, and she'd believed it because she'd always half believed it about herself. That was the part Celeste had known to use. 6 years ago, Elena Marlowe had been a woman who could be made to run by one well-aimed lie, because she'd never been entirely convinced she deserved to stay. She looked at her hands around the gas station cup. She wasn't that woman anymore. So, the diner reopened the following Monday. She hadn't planned to close it for a week, but there were things to do. Conversations to have with Roman's lawyers about legal acknowledgement of paternity, which Roman insisted on formalizing immediately, and which Miles received with the gravity of someone signing a historic document. A call to Mrs. Paulson, who cried audibly and without apology. 2 days of the twins needing to simply be home with their mother, and the radiator and the sea. No particular demands, just the restoration of ordinary life after extraordinary disruption. On the 3rd day, Roman brought groceries and made breakfast and burned the first batch of pancakes comprehensively. Miles looked at the burned pancakes, looked at Roman. Try lower heat, he said. Roman looked at the pan, adjusted. The second batch was better. Mara ate 4 of them and announced that she'd had better, which was untrue. And Roman said, I'll get better, which he said the way he said things that were going to be true. Elena stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and watched them and said nothing. The diner reopened Monday. Dee came in, looked at Elena's face, looked at the way Elena moved through the space, something different in it, some quality that had changed between last week and this one, and said, You look like someone put something down. I did, Elena said. Good. Dee tied on her apron. The coffee machine was acting up. I bled the line. Thank you. Fiat. Don't thank me. Thank the wrench. Dee went to start the prep and turned back once. Is he going to keep leaving $100 bills? Elena almost smiled. Probably. Dee considered this. I could live with that. The conversation she'd been building toward happened 3 weeks later. Not planned. The twins were at school, the diner was between rushes, and Roman came in at 10 and sat at the counter and ordered black coffee with the exact automaticity of a man who had been doing this for months now, which he had, and Elena poured it, and they were alone in the diner with the late morning light coming through the water-streaked windows. She'd been thinking about what to say for 3 weeks. She'd constructed sentences and dismantled them. She'd started from blame and finished at something else. She'd mapped the territory of it repeatedly and arrived every time at the same understanding. She wasn't angry at him anymore. She'd been angry, initially, not at the lie, which was Celeste's, but at the 6 years he'd spent accepting the version he'd been given. At the year he'd waited after finding her, approaching carefully while her children grew older without him. There was something legitimate in that anger, and she'd sat with it and let it run its course, and then she'd looked at the other side of it, that he'd accepted what he'd been told because she had run. And running was consent when you didn't know otherwise. That he'd waited because he was afraid of being too much and not enough simultaneously. That he'd walked into a diner and ordered black coffee and stayed. She set her hands flat on the counter. "I'm not going to forgive you all at once," she said. He looked at her. He didn't pretend not to know what they were talking about. "I know. There are things I need from you: consistency, patience, a tolerance for the fact that some mornings I wake up and I think about those 6 years and I feel something that isn't warm toward you." She looked at him directly. "That's going to be true for a while. Maybe a long while." "I know that too," he said. "And there are things I can offer you: honesty, the chance to know your children, the possibility—" She paused. "The possibility of something built differently than what we had before. Something that knows what it cost." Roman looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way he'd looked at Miles through the diner window before he'd even known Miles was his, with that undisguised attention that had no strategy in it. "That's more than I expected," he said quietly. "Don't make it into something it isn't yet," she said. "It's a beginning, that's all." "A beginning is everything," he said. She picked up the cloth, started wiping the counter, the familiar motion of it, the work of it, the ordinary persistence of a life maintained by daily action. "Drink your coffee," she said. "It's getting cold." He drank his coffee. Mint. 6 months later in April, Elena reopened the diner with new windows. Roman had offered to replace them in November, and she'd said no, and then in February she'd said yes, because the old ones let in the cold in ways that were charming in the fall and genuinely terrible in February, and saying yes didn't mean anything except that she'd decided the windows needed replacing. The new windows were clear and sealed properly, and the light through them in the morning was different, cleaner, more direct, the sea through them sharp instead of soft. She stood behind the counter on the first morning after installation and looked at the light and thought, this is still the same place. Better windows, same diner, same faded apron, same coffee. The work was the same. The choosing to stay was the same. The difference was in what the staying meant now. It didn't mean hiding anymore. The marriage was private. Roman had asked in March, not with ceremony, just across the kitchen table after the twins were in bed, his voice carrying the same quality it had when he'd said, "A beginning is everything," careful and absolute and meaning exactly what it said. She'd said she needed to think. She'd thought for 3 weeks. She'd thought about what she was agreeing to and what it would cost and what it would mean for Miles and Mara, who adored their father with the specific fervor of children who'd been given something they hadn't known was missing and now couldn't imagine without. She'd thought about what it meant for her, not for the version of her that had loved him at 23 and been broken by a staged lie, but for this version, the one who'd survived the crater, the one who'd built something in the quiet, the one who knew now, with a certainty that didn't require any particular story to support it, that she was enough. She'd said yes in April, on a Tuesday morning, standing in the kitchen with cold coffee and her children eating breakfast. She'd said it quietly, and he'd gone very still the way he went still when something mattered more than he'd prepared for. And Miles had looked up from his toast and said, "About time," and Mara had said, "Can I have a new dress?" And Elena had laughed, the real kind, the kind that had been sparse for 6 years and was gradually becoming less so. They married in June at the Cliffside Estate. 8 people. Keller is a witness because he'd been present for enough of it that excluding him seemed unjust. Dee because she'd earned it. Mrs. Paulson, who wore her best coat and brought a casserole. Roman's attorney, who was also his longest-standing associate, and had the decency to cry quietly and deny it afterward. The twins stood beside them in the evening light. Miles in a small suit that he'd worn with the air of someone who found formal clothing tolerable for specific and limited occasions. Mara in the new dress she'd negotiated for, which was green and had too many buttons, and she was extremely satisfied with it. The sun was going down over the water. The sea was doing the thing it did in June, going gold and then copper and then a deep bruised purple at the horizon line, and the air smelled of salt and the pine trees at the edge of the property. Roman took her hand. She looked at him. at this man who had walked into her diner in the rain and upended every quiet arrangement she'd made with her own survival, who had sat at her counter and drunk bad coffee and bought a house on a cliff and stayed, who had walked into a warehouse without hesitation and emerged with something that mattered more than any territory or operation or empire, who had learned, slowly and imperfectly, the grammar of a family that had formed without him and made room anyway. He looked at her, and his face was open in a way she'd seen it rarely. In the car outside the school that first day, when Miles had said something about the haunted house, in the kitchen over burned pancakes. The specific expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't know he was trying to get to. "You were always more than enough," he said quietly. "I was the one who had to become worthy." Elena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had turned around in a rain-soaked diner with a coffee pot in her hand and nearly dropped it. She thought about the woman who had driven north and north and north on nothing but certainty and grief. She thought about 6 years of double shifts and eviction notices and parking lot tears and the particular loneliness of being the only adult who knew the whole story. She thought about Miles saying, "I don't want you to be sad anymore," in the dark of his room. She thought about Mara directing a guard through a hand-clapping game in a warehouse, unafraid, utterly herself. She thought about what it had cost, all of it, the whole accumulated weight of it, and what it had built. She took his hand. "We were both late," she said. "We got here." The sun finished going down. The twins moved against their sides, Miles on Roman's left, Mara pressing her face into Elena's arm, and the sea moved below them with its indifferent, ancient patience, and the pine trees held their ground, and the cliffside house behind them had its lights on, every window, the whole face of it, the way a place looked when it was no longer empty. Elena looked at the water. The diner would open tomorrow morning, same as always. She'd tie on the apron and start the coffee, and the regulars would come, and the light would come through the new windows clean and clear. Miles would do his homework at the back table after school and argue the logic of his math problems and be right more often than not. Mara would tell elaborate stories to whoever would listen and be opinionated about the menu and take up more room than her size suggested. Roman would come in at 9 and order black coffee and leave an amount of money that Dee would find outrageous and pocket anyway. The ordinary persistence of a life that had survived its worst version of itself and kept going. That was the whole of it. The sum of 6 years of running and 6 months of learning to stay. Not the romantic story, not the redemption arc, not the version where love fixed everything it had broken. The real version, which was harder and more specific and more worth having. 2 flawed people and their extraordinary children standing on a cliff above the sea in June, figuring out in real time what it meant to build something honest out of everything that had been taken from them. Elena held Roman's hand. The twins pressed against their sides. Below, the sea did what it always did. And in the diner on the coastal road, the lights were off and the chairs were up, and the new windows reflected the last of the evening light, and the closed sign faced the empty street, and on the counter in the dark, a folded $100 bill sat under the sugar caddy, left there that morning the way it was always left, the small, persistent evidence of a man who had stopped running from the right things and started staying for the ones that mattered. Tomorrow morning, Elena Marlowe would walk through that door, turn the sign to open, and begin again. The same as she always had, different in every way that counted,